For over a month, American and Israeli air forces have waged a relentless, weeks-long air campaign over Iran. By every conventional military metric, it has been an overwhelming success. The Allied forces have essentially achieved complete aerial supremacy. They've obliterated the vast majority of Iran's air defenses, systematically dismantled all its missile launch capabilities, and sunk nearly all of the tonnage in its surface fleet. This kinetic victory extends all the way to the highest levels of the regime. Precision missile strikes have eliminated swaths of the Islamic Republic's most senior hardline leadership. So, looking strictly at the battlefield, the United States and Israel have won the kinetic war. They control the skies and have shattered the enemy's conventional military machine. Yet, the United States is currently trapped in what is rapidly becoming its most severe foreign policy disaster since 2003. The military victories are an illusion. The Iranian regime knew they could never survive a head-to-head conventional fight, so they abandoned it. Instead, they chose to fight a separate war against the global economy. This map shows the geography of that economic war, specifically focusing on Iran's greatest asymmetrical weapon, the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, this waterway is only 54 kilometers wide, yet the sea lanes right through the center carry 1/5 of the entire global supply of oil and liquefied natural gas. The transit lanes are so tight that there is only space for 2 massive tanker ships, one running in each direction. Iran doesn't need a functioning navy to close this passage. They simply launch cheap, long-range drones and missiles at merchant ships every few days. This creates a massive radius of fear. Shipping companies refuse to send their vessels through, and insurance companies flatly refuse to cover them. The resulting supply shock has been immediate and severe. Since the conflict began, global oil prices have spiked by more than 40%, while natural gas prices in Europe have surged past 70%. By weaponizing its geography, Iran keeps the strait closed by default. If the United States cannot force these waters open, the resulting energy shortage risks pushing Western inflation rates well over 5% and dragging the global economy into a recession. Facing this economic hostage situation, the American commander-in-chief is left with a terrible set of options. The first is to maintain the status quo, continue the punishing airstrikes, and wait for the Iranian government to finally collapse under the pressure. But this strategy is financially and logistically unsustainable. The U.S. military does not have an infinite supply of weapons. They are rapidly burning through their inventory of high-tech interceptors, draining stockpiles that take years and billions of dollars to replace. In just the first 16 days of the conflict, U.S. forces fired off more than 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles. At nearly $4 million apiece, that is over $3 billion spent in weeks, consuming roughly a quarter of America's pre-war Tomahawk inventory. The physical toll on equipment and personnel is just as steep. The USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier has been deployed continuously for nearly 300 days. Ships are deteriorating, crews are exhausted, and the Navy is effectively running on fumes. Waiting it out is a losing game. Iran only has to endure the strikes to win, while the United States exhausts the military assets it desperately needs for potential conflicts in the Western Pacific, all while the global economy bleeds out. If waiting fails, the second option is extreme escalation, a full-scale ground invasion to manually overthrow the Iranian regime and physically secure the coastline. To understand why this is nearly impossible, you have to look at the landscape. Iran is shielded by towering mountain ranges like the Zagros and the Alborz. These are natural fortresses that completely neutralize the technological advantages of an invading army. We can calculate the manpower required for such a campaign by looking at the 2003 invasion of neighboring Iraq. That operation required roughly 300,000 U.S. soldiers to invade, and a peak of 160,000 to occupy a relatively flat country. Iraq is geographically about 1/4 the size of Iran, with less than 1/3 of the population. Adjusting those troop ratios for Iran's massive scale means an invasion force would require over 1 million soldiers and an occupying force of well over 500,000. Committing those kinds of numbers would spark a conflict on the scale of the Vietnam War. Finding enough personnel to fill those ranks would inevitably require the United States to reinstate the military draft. That makes a full ground invasion a political impossibility. It proves a hard truth of military strategy. Bombs cannot alter geography, and without the sheer manpower to occupy those mountains, the US cannot manually force the country into submission. This leaves the military with half measures aimed at securing leverage. They could try seizing critical Iranian islands or use the US Navy to personally escort commercial tankers through the strait. One heavily discussed target is Karg Island, a small landmass just off the southwestern coast. Capturing this specific terminal facility would sever roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports, theoretically giving the US a massive bargaining chip to force the strait open. The problem is the battle itself. Fighting to take and hold that island carries a high probability of destroying the very oil infrastructure the US wants to capture. Wiping out Iran's supply entirely would just pull more oil from the global market, causing prices to spike even further and making the economic crisis worse. As for escorting ships directly through the strait, the logistics simply don't hold up. Because the transit lanes are so tight, every 2 commercial tankers would require a dedicated naval destroyer and a massive umbrella of aerial cover. The US Navy simply does not have enough unassigned destroyers in the region to shepherd civilian ships through a continuous gauntlet. Even if American forces captured the islands and secured the beaches, it wouldn't solve the core issue. Iran doesn't need to hold the coastline to project threat. They can just launch their stockpile of kamikaze drones from cave systems, hundreds of kilometers inland, rendering any coastal seizures entirely useless. The United States is locked in a strategic matrix with no exits. The air campaign won't topple the regime. A full ground invasion is impossible to execute, and targeted tactical seizures only exacerbate the economic damage without reopening the shipping lanes. Much like the conflict in Ukraine, what was intended to be a rapid display of overwhelming force has devolved into a grinding war of attrition. It heavily favors the side relying on cheap, asymmetrical weapons to wait out their opponent. The decision facing the president is politically toxic. He must either negotiate with the Iranian regime from a position of weakness, conceding to their demands in order to open the strait, or do nothing and watch the global economy drift steadily toward a recession. It reveals a harsh reality about modern warfare. A superpower can drop thousands of precision munitions, eliminate enemy leadership, and achieve absolute supremacy in the skies. But if it cannot overcome the immovable laws of geography, it can still lose the war.